January 29, 1945. The train screamed through the Bavarian night like a wounded animal, its iron wheels grinding over frozen rails that shimmered pale beneath the moon. Inside one of the unheated carriages, a dozen young women huddled together for warmth, their Luftwaffe auxiliary uniforms threadbare after months of retreat and rationing. Frost traced white veins along the windows. Breath hung in clouds. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled, a dull, continuous reminder that the Reich they had served was collapsing faster than anyone dared whisper. Lissel Bauer sat stiff-backed on the splintered bench, clutching a Red Cross leaflet crumpled in her palm. She had been a radio operator, trained to transmit coordinates and intercept Allied messages. Her hands, once deft over dials and wires, now trembled from hunger and cold. She was 21 but looked older under the flat light of the carriage lamp, her cheeks hollow, eyes wide and rimmed red. Across from her, Anna Voigt, only 19, once a farm girl who joined the Flakhelferinnen to defend the fatherland, tried to hide her tears behind the collar of her coat. Beside Anna, stern, quiet Marta Kuhn kept her gaze fixed on the black night, her jaw clenched tight, every muscle resisting the humiliation of surrender. They had been told many things. Goebbels' voice still echoed in their memory from the radios they once operated, better death than captivity. The Anglo-Americans are cruel without honor. They will starve you, humiliate you, destroy your womanhood. In the barracks they'd whispered worse, stories of women violated, tortured, paraded through foreign streets. Even as the Wehrmacht crumbled and the once proud Luftwaffe scattered, these warnings had lodged deep. To be captured was to vanish into nightmare. The train lurched. A lantern swung, casting jagged shadows across the compartment. Through the thin wall came muffled shouts in English, a language none of them truly understood beyond radio static and propaganda films. Lissel's stomach twisted tighter. She thought of her brother, lost at Stalingrad, and her mother, who had waved her off at the station with forced pride 2 years before. Was she thinking of her now? Did she know her daughter was somewhere between enemy lines and an unknown ocean? When the doors finally screeched open at dawn, the winter air knifed inside. American soldiers stood on the snowy platform, rifles slung casually across shoulders, breath fogging the air. They looked tired but not feral, boys, some barely older than the prisoners themselves, with stubble and heavy coats. One raised his voice, "Out. Schnell. Move." The accent was foreign but the intent clear. The women gathered their few belongings, a scarf, a photograph, a dented canteen. Boots crunched on ice as they stepped down into captivity. The next hours blurred into a march, through snow-dusted fields, past barns and curious villagers peeking from doorways, into the belly of waiting trucks. The vehicles smelled of gasoline and wet wool. No one spoke. The Americans did not shout or strike. They checked lists, counted heads, passed out canteens of water. Still, fear clung like the frost on Lissel's lashes. She kept imagining a trap, kindness before cruelty. Marta, always composed, whispered once, "Remember what they told us. Do not trust." Days later they reached the port of Le Havre, a wreck of bombed-out docks and cold Atlantic wind. There they saw it for the first time, the vast gray hull of a Liberty ship, its deck alive with movement as thousands of prisoners, mostly men in ragged Wehrmacht coats, boarded under guard. The women were herded separately, their groups small compared to the male battalions. The gangway clanged beneath their boots. Overhead, gulls cried, their wings slicing the sky. On board, the women were surprised by small mercies. They were issued blankets, thin but clean. Meals, watery stew, black bread, coffee, arrived at regular intervals. American medics inspected frostbitten toes and bandaged sores without a word of contempt. It was confusing. Marta kept her spine straight, muttering that this was only to keep them alive for worse fates. Anna, who had barely eaten in days, devoured her rations with trembling hands but flinched at every sailor's glance. At night, lying in the dark hold, Lissel listened to the ship's heartbeat, the thrum of engines, the hiss of waves against steel, and felt the world she'd known shrink to a pinpoint. Once she had believed in the Reich's destiny, believed the voices on the radio that promised victory and purity and protection. Now she floated on an enemy ship, alive but unmoored, carrying nothing but fear and a fading sense of purpose. She thought of biscuits, though she had never seen one. Only bread, coarse and black, the bread of a nation at war. What would food taste like in the enemy's land? Would it be a weapon too? The Atlantic was merciless that winter. Storms tossed the Liberty ship like a toy, and seasick soldiers leaned over rails in misery. Yet the Americans maintained routine, inspections, meals, Red Cross checks. One guard, a lanky southerner with a face pink from wind, passed the women mugs of thin soup and managed a shy smile. Anna whispered later, astonished, "He smiled at us. Like we are people." Marta scoffed but didn't contradict her. After nearly 2 weeks, a dawn of improbable warmth greeted them, New York Harbor. Fog drifted low over the water as the skyline emerged, jagged and unreal. The Statue of Liberty loomed ghost-like through mist. For many it was the first time seeing America, a land painted as both decadent and savage in Nazi papers. Now it stood indifferent, steel and stone and promise. But they would not stay. After brief processing, their group was loaded onto trains bound for the American interior. Rumors spread quickly. Some said they were headed to cotton plantations. Others feared secret prisons. Lissel found herself staring out the train window at a landscape nothing like home. Rolling farmland, wooden barns, wide skies. The fields were brown with winter but vast, unscarred by bombing. Children waved at the passing cars. It unsettled her, the ordinariness of peace. Along the way they met other prisoners, men who had been in America longer. A gaunt corporal warned them softly in German, "It's strange here. They feed us. They treat us fair." Another added, almost sheepish, "You can work. Read." It is not what they said. Marta dismissed this as enemy manipulation, but Lissel tucked the words away like a secret she wasn't ready to believe. By the time the train pulled into a small Texas town, the air had changed. It was no longer the wet cold of Europe but dry and sun-soaked even in winter, carrying the scent of dust and something sweet, unfamiliar. A sign flashed past, "Hern." Soldiers guided them off the cars into a camp ringed by barbed wire but tidy, almost domestic. There were low wooden barracks, watchtowers manned but relaxed, and somewhere nearby, the faint clatter of kitchen pans. The women filed into the intake building. Papers were checked. A medic peered at Lissel's frostbitten fingers and applied salve without a word. An officer, not unkind, explained through an interpreter. They would be housed together, allowed letters, given work if they wished. The Geneva Convention, though none of them trusted its promise, seemed to live here. For the first time since capture, Lissel felt a thread of exhaustion slip past fear. Her legs ached. She wanted to sit, to breathe. She did not know this camp, this land, or these smiling boys in uniform. She only knew she was alive and very far from the war that had consumed her youth. That night in the barracks the women spoke quietly. Some prayed. Some cursed. Anna stared at the ceiling and whispered, "Maybe it will not be so bad." Marta shot her a glare but said nothing. Lissel lay awake, staring into darkness that smelled faintly of fresh timber and soap, and felt her world tilt, slightly, almost imperceptibly, away from terror toward a numb, tentative curiosity. Before dawn, footsteps and the rattle of pans woke them. The door swung open. A guard motioned for them to rise. Outside, the sky was streaked with pink and gold, a Texas sunrise bleeding across endless flat land. Smoke curled from a nearby kitchen building. The scent drifted over, rich, savory, unknown. The women looked at one another in confusion. No one moved. Somewhere beyond the fence, an American cook shouted a single word the prisoners did not know but somehow understood: breakfast. The first morning in Texas began not with gunfire or shouts, but with the slow clang of a bell and the drifting scent of smoke and fat. Lissel woke startled, the wooden bunk beneath her creaking as she sat up. Around her, the other women stirred, blankets sliding from thin shoulders, hair tangled from restless sleep. Outside, the sky was a pale wash of color, peach and dusty blue, stretched wide and unfamiliar. For a moment she forgot where she was, until the barbed wire fence caught the dawn light and the distant watchtower blinked with a soldier's silhouette. Captivity had not ended, it had simply changed shape. They lined up under the watch of young Americans whose faces looked more like farm boys than monsters. One yawned, his rifle dangling with casual ease. Another tipped his helmet back and said something in English that made his companion chuckle. The women kept their eyes low, fearful of appearing defiant, yet there was no barked order, no sudden strike. They were counted, sorted, then walked in quiet columns toward a squat building with smoke curling from a vent. From within came a chorus of metal pans, voices, and, most bewildering, laughter. Inside the mess hall, the warmth hit like a tide. The air was thick with smells Lissel couldn't place. Something rich and meaty, baked bread, coffee so strong it seemed to rise like a ghost. Long tables stretched across the room, each laid with tin trays. American cooks in stained aprons ladled food from steaming vats. For an instant the women hesitated, the image of enemy soldiers serving them so strange it felt like a trick. Marta, ever suspicious, whispered, "They fatten us first." Anna swallowed hard, eyes wide but hungry. The meal was plain but shocking in its generosity. Scrambled eggs yellow as summer fields, bread soft enough to tear with fingers, thick oatmeal laced with sugar. The women ate carefully at first, waiting for some humiliation to follow. None came. Guards wandered among the tables, joking among themselves but never jeering at their captives. One tall man with sandy hair paused to refill Anna's cup with coffee and smiled shyly before walking on. She stared after him as if he performed a magic trick. "He thanked me," she murmured in disbelief. Marta only scowled deeper, though her spoon scraped her bowl clean. After breakfast came processing. Papers signed, small photographs taken, medical inspections quick and impersonal. A translator, a brisk woman in a Red Cross armband, explained their rights. They could write home, receive packages, take work assignments if they chose. They would be housed together in a section of the camp set aside for female auxiliaries. Lissel listened in silence, stunned by the calm order of it all. Back in Germany, she had braced herself for chains and shouting. Here, the war felt far away, as if the Americans had decided to win by sheer indifference. Life at the camp settled into an odd rhythm. The barracks were bare but clean, with potbelly stoves that gave off welcome heat. Every morning began with roll call in the yard, followed by meals and, for those willing, work. Sorting uniforms, mending nets, assisting in the camp laundry. Some prisoners volunteered for farm labor nearby, glad for fresh air and the sight of fields instead of fences. In the evenings, they gathered in common rooms where battered books in German circulated alongside English primers. The U.S. Guards seemed to prefer boredom over cruelty. Most wanted the war to end as badly as the women did. Yet trust did not come easily. Marta remained vigilant, her sharp eyes searching for hidden malice. She warned the others never to speak too freely, to remember that they were still prisoners. "Kindness can be strategy," she would say, her voice clipped. Anna, however, thought quickly. She practiced English words shyly with the cooks, laughed once when a guard tried to mimic German and failed spectacularly. "Maybe they're not as we were told," she said one night, earning a glare from Marta. Lissel said nothing, torn between relief and guilt. She felt gratitude for full stomachs and warmth, but also shame. Shame for having believed so deeply in a cause that now seemed paper-thin. What surprised her most was how invisible their captors made the ideology she'd been raised on. No one lectured them about democracy. No one sneered about Hitler or the Reich. Instead there was routine. Food. Safety. Even small gestures of humanity. One afternoon, as Lissel worked in the laundry, a sudden Texas thunderstorm cracked open the sky. Rain pounded the tin roof in a deafening roar. She flinched, memories of air raid sirens flickering back, but then saw an American guard leaning in the doorway, letting the rain soak his hat while he grinned at the downpour like a boy. The normalcy of it undid her more than any speech could have. Still, letters from home were sobering. When mail finally arrived weeks later, news came scrawled on thin paper. Cities reduced to rubble, families fleeing east, fathers and brothers killed or vanished. Lissel read her mother's trembling words, "Food is gone, the nights are cold, pray for peace," and felt the distance between Texas and Bavaria stretch like an ocean wider than the one she had crossed. She wanted to cry but couldn't. Anna wept openly over a letter that told of her village burned. Marta read hers stone-faced, then tucked it under her pillow without a word. As winter bled into the pale edges of spring, rumors moved through the camp like wind. Germany was failing. The Russians had reached Berlin's outskirts. Some guards whispered about Roosevelt's death, others about victory parades already planned. For the women, each rumor chipped away at certainty. They had been taught that surrender meant annihilation, yet here they were, fed, clothed, even smiled at. They had been told their homeland was invincible, but each passing day made that harder to believe. One evening, the camp hosted a small concert. A group of German POWs, men from another section, played violins and an accordion under a bare bulb while prisoners and guards alike gathered to listen. Lissel stood at the back, arms folded, feeling both safe and unmoored. The music was old folk tunes, songs of home and green hills and rivers she missed with an ache. Across the room, an American sergeant leaned against the wall, eyes half closed, letting the melody wash over him. For a fleeting moment, the distance between enemy and enemy vanished, replaced by something wordless and human. Lissel blinked hard against the sting in her eyes. Not every moment was gentle. Now and then, a guard's barked command reminded them of their place. There were searches, curfews, and a constant reminder of barbed wire. The women were still prisoners, stripped of freedom, far from everything familiar. Yet the brutality they'd feared never came. The danger was subtler, the slow erosion of hatred, the quiet unraveling of indoctrination. Lissel sensed it most when she found herself laughing softly at an American joke she barely understood, or when she caught herself humming a tune she'd heard on their radios. Marta noticed too. One night, after Anna returned from kitchen duty beaming about learning the word thank you, Marta confronted them both in the dim barracks. "Do not forget who you are," she snapped. "They are the enemy. They bombed our cities. They killed our men." Her voice cracked on the last word, betraying grief beneath the steel. Lissel wanted to answer but couldn't find the language. She knew Marta was right, and yet, she wasn't sure anymore. Weeks turned into months. The Texas sun grew warmer, and with it came small freedoms. Time in the camp gardens, chances to barter handmade trinkets for extra soap or thread. Some guards treated them with friendly indifference, a few genuine kindness. Lissel found herself watching the horizon more than the fence now, wondering what lay beyond. At night she dreamed less of bombs and more of kitchens. Strange kitchens full of smells she couldn't name. Then one cool morning, a subtle change rippled through the camp. Trucks arrived stacked with new supplies. The kitchen clanged louder than usual, laughter spilled out the door. A guard passing by muttered a word Lissel had begun to recognize: Sunday. Something special was coming. She didn't know why, but anticipation hummed in the air like static before a storm. Even Marta noticed, narrowing her eyes as if bracing for bad news. Before dawn broke fully, the bell rang again. The women dressed quickly, boots clattering across wooden floors, breath misting in the crisp air. They followed the guards toward the mess hall, confusion sharpening as an unfamiliar smell reached them, warm, savory, peppery. Nothing like the porridge or eggs they'd known. Anna sniffed the breeze, puzzled. Lissel felt her stomach knot with hunger and curiosity alike. Whatever awaited them beyond that swinging door was no ordinary meal. And somehow, though she couldn't explain why, she felt it might matter more than breakfast ever should. The mess hall doors swung open with a metallic groan, and a wave of heat rolled out, carrying a scent so rich and foreign it seemed almost impossible. Lissel stepped inside cautiously, Anna close at her shoulder, Marta behind them like a silent sentinel. The room was alive with motion. American cooks in flour-dusted aprons moved quickly between long steel trays, ladling thick white sauce over golden, pillowy mounds of bread. Coffee hissed from giant urns, its dark aroma cutting through the haze of frying sausage. Light poured through high windows, catching the steam until it seemed the whole room floated in some surreal, fragrant fog. For a moment, no one moved. The German women froze in the doorway, unsure if this was meant for them. The food did not look like food they knew. The sauce, creamy, flecked with pepper and bits of meat, looked almost indecent in its abundance. One cook, a broad-shouldered man with a gap-toothed grin, noticed their hesitation. "Come on," he said, waving them forward with his ladle. "Eat." They didn't need to know English to understand the gesture. Anna went first. She took the tin tray with trembling hands, staring at the steaming biscuits now drenched in gravy. Her eyes darted to Lissel as if asking permission. Lissel, equally uncertain, stepped forward next. Marta followed last, face carved from stone, every movement deliberate. They shuffled to the benches where other prisoners had already begun eating. Men mostly, some laughing quietly at the strange dish but eating nonetheless. The Americans watched from a distance, talking among themselves but not intruding. The first bite was small. Lissel broke off a corner of the biscuit, dipped it in the creamy sauce and placed it on her tongue. It was soft, warm, almost sweet beneath the pepper and savory sausage. For a second she was too stunned to react. Then hunger took over. She swallowed hard and took another bite, larger, faster. Something inside her, a knot wound tight since surrender, unraveled just enough to let heat and flavor in. Around her, other women hesitated, tasted, then fell into quiet, almost reverent eating. The only sounds became spoons against tin, low murmurs of surprise. Anna was the first to cry. A sudden, sharp sob escaped her before she could hide it. She pressed her sleeve to her face, but the tears kept coming, silent, unstoppable. Lissel felt her own eyes sting, unbidden. It wasn't the food alone, it was what the food meant. After months of fear, lies, and hunger, the enemy had fed them something warm and good simply because it was morning. Marta sat rigid, biscuit untouched at first. Her lips trembled as if fighting some unseen enemy harder than any American. Slowly, almost reluctantly, she lifted her fork and tasted. She did not cry, but her eyes softened, her posture eased a fraction. All their lives, these women had been told that to fall into enemy hands was a fate worse than death. Goebbels' voice, always confident and venomous, had promised starvation and degradation. The Reich's newspapers had painted Americans as mongrels, violent, decadent, without honor. Yet here was a meal that any German mother might have dreamed of for her hungry child. Here was kindness unannounced, unadorned, not accompanied by lectures or jeers. It struck like a quiet thunderclap, rearranging the world. Lissel remembered the night her training officer had told her that surrender was betrayal. She'd believed it then, proud in her crisp uniform, certain of Germany's strength. Now she stared at a plate that told a different truth. Power didn't always roar, sometimes it gave breakfast. She looked across the table at Anna, still weeping softly, and felt something she hadn't in months: safety. Fragile, yes. Strange. But safety nonetheless. The Americans seemed almost oblivious to the psychological earthquake they had caused. To them it was just food. One young guard, freckles scattered across his nose, passed by and refilled their coffee without a word. Another, perhaps trying to break tension, grinned and said in broken German, "Gut? Ja." Anna hiccuped through her tears and nodded vigorously. The guard laughed, not cruelly, just lightly, as if relieved. Afterward, as trays were cleared and the women drifted back toward the barracks, the mood had shifted. Conversation, once hushed and wary, grew tentative but real. "It was good," someone whispered, almost guilty. Another admitted she had eaten until she was full for the first time in weeks. Marta walked beside Lissel in silence, face unreadable, but when Lissel glanced sideways she saw a crack in the hard mask. Not surrender, but weariness mixed with something like relief. That night, the barracks buzzed with quiet talk. The meal became a touchstone, dissected and remembered. Some clung to suspicion. Perhaps this was just a ploy to make them compliant. Marta voiced that theory more than once, unwilling to let go of her guard. Yet even she could not deny the warmth that lingered. Anna, wide-eyed, confessed, "They don't hate us. I think, maybe they never did." The statement hung in the air like a dangerous revelation. No one argued. Even Marta stayed silent. The next days reinforced the fracture in old beliefs. Meals remained hearty, bread, meats, vegetables rare in war-torn Germany. Guards remained mostly polite. Work was fair, sometimes even dull. Letters continued to trickle in, full of loss and ruin, yet here in Texas there was routine and even moments of gentle absurdity. One morning, an American cook tried to teach Anna the word gravy. She repeated it awkwardly, earning a laugh from the whole kitchen. The moment was so ordinary, so human, that Lissel felt dizzy with the strangeness of it. Still, not all doubts vanished. Each kindness forced the women to reckon with what they'd been taught, and what they themselves had served. Lissel wrestled hardest. She thought of the broadcasts she'd sent, messages that kept bombers flying and soldiers fighting. She thought of her brother, lost in a war their leaders had promised was noble. Now she saw that those same leaders had lied not only about victory but about the very nature of the enemy. It was a betrayal deeper than defeat. Marta's struggle was different. She had joined not from zeal but from duty, to protect what little she had. Letting go of suspicion felt like weakness, a surrender of self-preservation. Yet one evening, Lissel caught her staring out at the sunset beyond the fence, her face softer than usual. When she noticed Lissel watching, Marta said quietly, "If they mean to break us, they are clever. They use kindness like a knife." But there was no venom in her tone, only exhaustion. Lissel said nothing, knowing that even admitting confusion was a step neither of them had imagined taking. By spring, the women moved through camp with less fear. They learned bits of English, worked steadily, even traded shy smiles with some guards. Life was still captivity but no longer terror. The walls remained, but inside them, the enemy had begun to look unsettlingly human. Propaganda unraveled not with speeches, but with simple acts. A blanket, a refill of coffee, a plate of warm biscuits under a Texas sunrise. And yet, as comfort grew, so did an unspoken question none dared voice aloud. If everything they had been told was false, then what had they fought for? What had all the sacrifice meant? Lissel felt the question hover each night as she lay awake, listening to the distant hum of American trucks and the soft breathing of her bunkmates. War had stolen her certainty. Kindness was stealing what remained of her anger. In its place was a hollow space she didn't know how to fill. One morning, a letter arrived that deepened the fracture. News that Hitler was dead, Berlin surrounded, the Reich in shambles. The camp erupted in whispers and stunned silence. Marta sat motionless, hands clenched, while Anna wept quietly. Lissel felt a strange mix of grief and liberation, as if a spell had finally broken. The world they'd been trained to defend was gone, and the enemy was not what they'd been warned of. The future for the first time was unknown. That night, as a soft wind rustled the Texas trees beyond the fence, Lissel realized the war inside her might last longer than the one that was ending. Tomorrow would bring more food, more work, more small kindnesses. But what would follow when freedom finally came, when they returned to a homeland shattered and a faith betrayed, remained a question too heavy to answer yet. The Texas sun had turned harsh by the summer of 1945, bleaching the camp's fences to a tired gray and baking the earth into cracked mosaics. Life inside had settled into a strange, quiet rhythm. Roll call, work, meals, letters from a country falling apart. The women no longer jumped at every sound, but the weight of waiting pressed heavier each day. Victory for the Allies was now certain. The Reich was dying. The question that stalked every night's silence was simple but terrifying. What happens to us when it's over? Lissel felt the shift first in the mailroom. One June morning she opened a letter from her mother written in shaky, desperate script. The war is lost. The Americans are everywhere. Our city is rubble. Come home if you can, my girl. There was no anger, no ideology left, only survival. Lissel sat on the edge of her bunk reading it over and over, numb. Across the room, Anna received nothing. Her family's village had been swallowed by the front months ago. Marta read a single page, folded it slowly, and stared at the wall for so long that Lissel wondered if she would ever move again. By August the guards had changed too. The brisk efficiency of wartime softened into something almost casual. They knew they were no longer guarding enemies who might tip the balance. They were caretakers of a defeated people. New arrivals brought news of Germany's surrender in May, of Hitler's suicide, of trials being prepared in Nuremberg. Some prisoners wept when they heard. Others went blank, their faces empty as broken statues. Lissel felt an ache she couldn't name, a mourning not for the Reich, which she now saw as a cruel lie, but for the years stolen by that lie, the brother lost to it, the self that had believed so fiercely. The camp's commandant addressed them one morning under the blazing sky. Through a translator, his words were simple. The war is over. You will all be repatriated as soon as ships are available. You will return to Germany. The announcement rippled through the crowd like a shockwave. Freedom, the word that had seemed unreachable, now dangled before them. Yet the women stood silent because freedom no longer meant what it once had. Germany was not the homeland they'd left. It was rubble and strangers and shame. That night, the barracks came alive with hushed voices. Anna whispered about rebuilding, about finding any surviving family. Marta sat stiff, distrust still etched into her spine but now turned inward, against her own country's betrayal. They used us, she said finally, her voice low but sharp. They filled our heads with lies and sent us to work for their madness. And now we return to nothing. Lissel didn't argue. She felt only the hollow truth of it. She thought of the first day here, her terror, the way propaganda had wrapped her like chains. That fear had been broken not by violence, but by a plate of warm food. It was almost absurd, and yet it had been the first crack that let light in. Departure came in waves. One by one, barracks emptied as prisoners boarded trains bound for the coast. The farewells were understated but heavy. Guards shook hands with those they'd come to know. Some prisoners left small gifts, embroidered handkerchiefs, sketches, a carved wooden spoon, as tokens of an unexpected bond. When Lissel's group was called, she packed the few possessions she'd gained. A worn book of English phrases, a photograph taken with Anna by a kind Red Cross nurse, a scarf she'd bartered for in camp. She touched the scarf's soft edge and thought how strange it was to carry safety back to a country that might not feel safe at all. The journey back across the Atlantic felt different from the one that had brought them. Then, fear had been a living thing gnawing at their stomachs. Now there was a heavy quiet, the weight of reflection. The ship rolled steadily over dark waters, filled with subdued conversations and long silences. Anna leaned against the railing at night, staring at stars she had never seen from bomblit Germany. "Do you think we will belong there anymore?" she asked. Lissel had no answer. Marta, standing nearby, murmured, "We will belong nowhere. Not there. Not here." For the first time her voice broke. As Europe's shattered coastline came into view, the smell of smoke and ruin met them before the ports did. When the women disembarked, they stepped into a world hollowed out. Cities were skeletal, streets filled with scavengers and displaced families. Hunger clung to every face. The Germany they'd left had promised triumph. The Germany they returned to was beaten, occupied, unsure of its soul. American soldiers patrolled the docks, but they were not the demons propaganda had painted. They were builders now, feeding children, keeping order among the wreckage. Lissel searched for home through landscapes she barely recognized. Her mother's house had lost its roof to bombing but still stood, fragile and stubborn. When they met, there were no triumphant embraces, only a long, trembling hug, a shared recognition of survival. Her mother touched her face, whispering, "You are so thin but you lived." Lissel didn't tell her about biscuits and gravy. She didn't know how to explain that her first taste of gentleness after the Reich had come from the enemy's kitchen. Anna had no home to return to. Her village was gone, her family unaccounted for. She drifted from displaced persons camp to camp, writing letters into the void. Marta found her father alive but broken, a man who had once preached loyalty to the Führer now sitting in ruins, silent with regret. Each woman carried the war differently, Anna with grief raw and searching, Marta with a bitterness sharpened by truth, Lissel with a fragile seed of doubt that had already begun to grow into something new. Years later, when the world tried to move on, memories of the Texas camp lingered like a quiet echo. Lissel would sometimes wake from dreams of that first breakfast, the steam rising off biscuits, the shock of kindness breaking through fear. She would remember how it felt when propaganda cracked, not from speeches or punishment, but from simple humanity. It was a small story in a war of vast brutality, but to her it mattered more than battles she could no longer name. Anna rebuilt slowly, finding work in a clinic run by the Americans during the occupation. She learned English well enough to translate for other refugees. Sometimes she laughed about how her first word had been gravy. Marta became a teacher in a town still struggling to trust the new world. She rarely spoke of the camp, but when her students asked about the war, she told them to beware any voice that demands blind hatred. "The enemy you fear," she would say softly, "may be the one who hands you bread when your own have abandoned you." For Lissel, the turning point had come long before she returned to Germany's ruins. It had arrived with the warmth of food on a cold, unfamiliar morning. It had arrived with the realization that fear can be manufactured and unmade. She built a quiet life after the war, never fully leaving behind the memory of both her service and her awakening. She did not excuse what she had done, but she refused to let the lies of her youth define the rest of her life. One autumn afternoon many years later, Lissel, now a grandmother, found herself telling her teenage grandson about the day she cried over a strange American meal. She described the long train, the terrifying surrender, the unexpected kindness. He listened wide-eyed, struggling to reconcile the picture of his gentle grandmother with the uniformed girl she had been. "Why did you cry?" he asked finally. Lissel smiled sadly and said, "Because I realized I had been wrong. And because I was so very hungry, for food and for truth." The story, small and almost domestic, was her quiet rebellion against the past. She knew history books would speak of grand battles, of politics and surrender papers. But for her, the war had ended the moment an enemy soldier smiled and offered seconds. And yet, not all wounds closed. Marta died still wary, though softer at the end. Anna built a family but never found her own. Lissel carried the grief of lost years like a shadow she could not shed. Still, each woman's life proved that indoctrination could be undone, that humanity, sometimes as simple as breakfast, could pierce the thickest armor of hate. In the final summer before her death, Lissel visited America. She stood in Texas heat once more, a free old woman where she had once been a frightened prisoner. The camp was long gone, replaced by fields and silence. She closed her eyes and smelled dust and sunlight, trying to summon the memory of that first morning. Somewhere deep inside, she felt the same unexpected warmth she had felt decades ago, when kindness shattered the lies she had built her life around. She smiled then, faint and private, because she finally understood what freedom truly meant. Not borders or flags or even the end of war, but the moment fear gives way to truth. And though the world still wrestled with its past, she knew that one simple human act in a Texas mess hall had changed her forever.